welcome back. It's another episode of the Better Learning Podcast. For the listeners, you know that we are always trying to break down the silos of education, and we're trying to make sure that we get representation from different aspects of education, whether it's from the school leader side to the ones that are supporting education, to the change makers that are outside of education but have ideas that are really good for us to hear. And so one of the things that we've been really focused to is how much the learning environment matters. And that's where my guest today, Regan Shields Ives, and I should have asked you before, is that how you typically introduce yourself?
Yes, I always say Regan like Megan, Shields Ives.
Perfect.
Yep.
And you've been involved with A4LE, who we've been tied to for a long time. So
yes.
Why don't you give a little bit of your background of how you got involved in this world? But I'm also going to ask you to start that conversation with what was school like for you when you went through, and we'll kind of talk through the evolution to how you've got involved with this.
Sure. So for me, school, I felt like, I went through school in, the 80s and, early 90s. And I feel like it was very traditional. I mean, most of my classes, we were in classrooms, we sat in rows. And I felt like I was the kind of student where I didn't stand out so much because I didn't need a lot of support, but I also wasn't, top of my class. So, it's sort of that kind of student where sometimes you can get lost in the cracks. And certainly in a traditional school model, sometimes that can happen pretty easily.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up, I actually moved around a bit when I was younger. I had lived in Connecticut for a while, and then we moved down to Texas until I was in sixth grade, or graduating or finishing sixth grade. And then we moved to Massachusetts when I was in seventh grade. So I did get an interesting cross-section around the country of different schools and different experiences.
Yeah. From those experiences, did you what was it like as a kid? Like, did you know things were different? Because I would think, I do a lot of work in the Northeast and in Texas, and there's definitely very different personalities in there. Were you recognizing it at the time?
Well, it was, I would say a majority of my early elementary education was in Texas, and things were all of the schools I went to were very new. I went to a brand new school. So it was actually really nice because we had brand new facilities. The area that we lived was quickly developing. So they were trying to keep up with, the number of schools to meet the population. So I had a good experience in terms of being in some pretty nice brand new facilities. And then when we moved to Massachusetts, the schools that I went to were a little bit older. So, you kind of saw a different perspective. Not that they were worse from an educational standpoint, but the facilities were older. And, they didn't have things like air conditioning and things that you would definitely need to have down in Texas.
Well, so tell me a little bit more of that journey then. So good student, but not like nothing.
So I felt like, and I'm jumping forward a little bit because of what I know now about how teaching and learning is different and the direction that I think, not only the educators, but the architects who are designing these spaces for learning are moving the needle. I feel like the experience that I had was pretty traditional, but it was a solid education, but there was, I felt like it was easy to not feel as engaged because of the way that we worked. We didn't do a lot of collaboration. It was a very individualized experience. So a lot of, my experience throughout school was just, doing my work, doing my homework, turning in my work. And that was, I got my grades. It wasn't a lot of, collaborating or working within the classroom in groups. I mean, we did some of that, but not nearly the way that I see that happening with students and the communities that we work with now.
Okay.
But I will say, all told, I had a good experience, but when I think back to, how I went through school and then the differences that we're seeing now, I can genuinely see why it is important to think more about collaborating with students or giving opportunities for students to break out of the classroom, to have smaller groups or work in smaller groups or come back together and be in a larger group. I think different personalities or different learners respond to that. And we didn't really have as much of a range of opportunities. And I can see where, as the type of learner that I was, I probably would have really thrived more if we did a lot of smaller group work or, had these opportunities to just collaborate differently or, work on project-based, experiences, because I'm a very visual learner. I mean, that's why I ended up being an architect, but it was not, I didn't have as many of those opportunities.
Yeah. So talk through that moment where you decided architecture is where I want to focus.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, it was when I was pretty young. I was in second grade where I loved building. I loved Legos. I mean, you can't talk to an architect who didn't love playing with Legos when they were growing up. But there really was something, I think it was that recognizing that I am a visual learner, that everything always made more sense to me when I was in the type of learning environment where I actually got to see what somebody was talking about. Math being a lot more of like a conceptual subject was more challenging for me, but the things where I could actually touch and feel and see, I recognized that I excelled in those kinds of environments with those subjects. So frankly, when I look back now, I didn't know exactly what it meant to be an architect. But when I learned, I think that's because I didn't have anyone in my family or we didn't know anybody that was an architect, but I learned that there was this career that you got to design spaces for people. And I would start to notice more as I entered into different buildings. Some spaces I just felt really, inspired by or wowed, or I was a lot more aware of my surroundings where, if I did go to a space that didn't feel right, I looked around a lot and I kind of would observe what it was about that space that, that wasn't really working for me. And I would think about how I might do that differently. So I think it was these little building blocks that started to evolve within me. And, as I went through school and as I think it was in high school where I really got to take my first drafting class, that was a lot of fun because I could start to bring it all together in a more concrete way and a more prescribed way, through the drafting class and some of the other exposure that I had.
Yeah. Isn't it funny how we get on certain tracks and you like, man, like, you ended up going there really early, and then you start like getting those other pieces combined to it. I remember for me, I'm like, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I ended up picking a major of like, it was like video, it was mass communication. I'm like, video production, and I'm like, that sounds good. And the path that you start doing it, because at that age, it's so hard to know that it does take like just that little bit of exposure to open up the door.
And even if we didn't know exactly, where it was going to lead us, just by identifying that this was something that you liked, I think gave me a bit of some guide rails to get there, even though the pathway was not, exactly linear. But it was, I love looking back to that time. I actually just worked with a group of, students, and there was a group of second graders. And so when I told them that when I was in second grade, when I decided I wanted to be an architect, I could see their eyes bulge out because, I think they could picture themselves. I mean, they are that age, and just to know that, you can decide what you want to be when you are so young.
Yeah, for sure. So at what moment there did you know you wanted to work on schools, or was that kind of an accident where you kind of got into working more on the education side?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was an accident, but I'd started my career not really specializing or knowing one way or the other that I wanted to work on a particular project type. And I think that is actually really important for architects because, and certainly designing schools, we touch on so many different aspects of creating spaces for people, that the school it's exciting because you can design gyms, you can design cafeterias, you sort of design all of these different spaces, and they all come together under the umbrella of a school. So I didn't know specifically until the first school project that I worked on. And I've always loved education, and I loved, my experiences through school and then into college and then graduate school. So education was always something that was very important to me. So thinking about a specialty that knits together architecture and education, to design schools and spaces for learning, just seemed like an obvious path. And it was the first school project that I worked on that confirmed that this was the right space for me. And I still do things that are outside of school design, which keeps things exciting and interesting. But my heart is really in designing spaces.
But
for
you're
learning.
right. It's those other things, the exposure into the other things too, that you can be like, oh, I didn't really think about it this way, but now I can bring this back to the next.
Yeah, I think
project.
it does make us stronger designers when we have experiences in things that may seem like they're not relevant specifically to a school, but when you think about everything that happens, within the bounds of, school or even outside, the site, it's so important to have these other experiences. And I think that does make for a stronger designer.
And so being in that, it made sense then to eventually get involved with A4LE, the Association for Learning Environments. And it sounds like you've had a lot of involvement in leadership levels. Like, what was your reason for wanting to take more of your time and put it into an association like that?
Well, I recognized that there was a lot I could learn from my peers. And I think looking for organizations like A4LE, which is, that's exactly what it's there for. It's for us to learn from each other. I recognized that was going to contribute to making me an even stronger designer, especially focusing on schools. So I first went to I'm from the Boston area. I first went to the Northeast Regional Conference and was really inspired by many of the sessions that I went to the point that I sent a few follow-up emails to find out if, we could continue this conversation or, have a separate kind of meeting. And it's one of those things where you sort of ask the question, and the next thing you know, you're brought into the next step. So I think because I had expressed interest in what had happened at the conference and looking for more ways to get involved, that opportunity opened for me. And in the New England chapter specifically, there was a need for more people, at the leadership level. And I was happy to jump on board and to get more involved, and been really happy with the whole experience.
So if you were talking to people about what's the passion, what's the message that you wish people would recognize who may not be involved in this type of work?
In A4LE specifically?
A4LE, or even, going beyond kind of more of like just the general community, like the general public that may be like, man, I haven't been to school since, like I was 18, or, maybe I have kids there, but I'm not really involved. What are the things that you've been involved with? You're like, man, I really wish everyone would understand what's going on here.
Well, I think what's so interesting about designing, for spaces for learning is that there's no one way to do it. And that is what I find really interesting, is that every school, every community that we work with takes a different path. And so it really allows us to explore many different avenues and to customize the design to meet that individual school or district's needs. And so I think as a designer, it's really exciting to think about never designing the same thing twice. And there's always something different. It's always exciting. And I think to be an architect that is involved with school design, we ourselves have to act as students. We are constantly learning, through organizations like A4LE. I think we go to these conferences, the symposium, so that we can continue to learn. So it's almost like we have to put ourselves in the same seat as some of these students to think about, we're learning as well. And so I think it's the evolution of the process that makes it exciting. And that's what I would love other people to know, that, there are certain professions where you learn the trade and you do it, and that you are the expertise, you're the expert. But that in our instance, it's like this ever evolving process. I think that is what makes it so exciting.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, like if you looked at some of your early projects versus some of the ones that you're working on now, what would be, like, if you can kind of talk through the visual side, like what would be the differences that you've seen in that evolution in your career?
Well, I think that, and it also depends on the client too, and what they're looking for. And I do think some of our earlier projects probably fell more under the umbrella of traditional cells and bells layout, where people were a little less willing to, I'd say, take risks, in a sense, to think about giving students the agency and the kind of empowerment to work outside of a classroom. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be complete chaos, but that if you give more responsibility, students will rise to that occasion. So what I have started to see is a bit of an evolution behind that idea of of keeping students contained, versus now like giving more freedom within the building for students to make choices and to move around, or to customize their learning experience in a way that works for them. Because I think it's common knowledge now that every learner is different, and what works for one does not work for the other. So to try to put them in a space where they have to learn the same way, it's just not netting the results that we all would like to see for our students.
Yeah. Oh, that is like a perfect example. Like I feel like that is the whole evolution of our industry, right? Like it feels like it is very rare that somebody's going to look at, if they're doing a new building or like a major renovation where they are, and not to say there aren't still schools that will do that traditional, but they're all thinking about this, and they're all trying to apply, all right, what have we learned? What have we learned? How do we do this? And it definitely does. I mean, you can see our shirts. We talk about this radically student-centered approach that we do, because, the ways we were doing before, I feel like we now know more. We know that works for some students, but not all. And we're not saying that you never get rid of like the lecture type of environment, but definitely being able to customize and personalize and be able to allow some of that choice and agency it's really important. And especially now where everything else in their lives, of these kids' lives, is personalized to them, to think now you're just going to throw this at the other 29 kids that are sitting in my class the same way. They're just not going to have it anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So I ask the question a lot, like when I have school superintendents on here, I'm like, what are you currently facing? What's keeping you up at night? Like, what are those challenges? What's it like for you? Like when you're going through, like we're going into the summer season here for you, and it may change throughout the year of what you're working on, but what are the things that you're constantly thinking through and fighting through and trying to figure out for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, depending on what phase of a project we're in, I would answer that differently. But I would say in general, one of the things that I'm constantly trying to work through in my mind, certainly when we're in the design phase of a project and we, do a lot of engagement work, and how do we listen to a number of different voices, starting with the educators, the students, and even the community, take all of that and incorporate it into a design that is going to satisfy the majority of the needs. We certainly can't check every box and satisfy every desire. So it's a big ask, and it's a heavy lift to take all that information and create a design that everybody in the community that's involved with this school project is going to feel good about. And it's always challenging when we have to prioritize one thing over another, or when budgets come into play, certain things have to be either reevaluated or unfortunately eliminated. And that I'm still trying to figure out how we do this so that everybody feels good about it, because that is another aspect of designing spaces for learning that I love. It's not just as a building or a space for one type of person. It's a community use space. I mean, it's really designed for the public. And so getting their input is really helpful and important. But, we do have to make choices along the way. And that can be a challenge.
Yeah. Everyone's got a slightly different approach of how they're doing. I'm curious to hear, like what is your way, like, when you're engaging on a project, how do you get all those voices involved into the table to be able to kind of get them out and then be able to process it?
Sure. And every project and every community is we address it differently. We definitely know that with a school design in varying states, wherever we're working, there are certain guidelines, there are requirements as far as programs, square footage. Every site has different constraints and opportunities. So we approach each one very differently, and we look at the ideal siting of a building, and we make sure that before we've gone too far down the road of incorporating all of feedback or input, that we're at least creating a starting point that will satisfy the needs, the underlying needs, and that's really the sort of the nuts and bolts, like how big does this building need to be to accommodate the student population? What are the different programs? But pretty soon after, we've started even just dealing with like the massing of a school, we do aim to engage with the students and the educators, and we typically will have separate workshops with them, usually starting with the students so that we can share that back with the educators. They're always really interested to hear some of the ideas that the students have. And then as part of the process, folding in the community as well, hearing from community members. Oftentimes it is people that have students either in the system or they're going to be in the system. But we also really enjoy hearing from seniors, some of the older community members, to hear, what their ideas are, and perhaps those that are not in support of a school project, because, it is something that impacts every taxpayer in the community. So we try to cast a wide net to hear a whole range of ideas and concerns and opportunities, and take that back to, I say to the office, but like we take it back and try to parse through and see, what are some of the common themes that we're hearing? What are some of the common, concerns that we're hearing, and start to group it together so that, back to my earlier point about trying to satisfy all the needs. We know that we're not going to hit every single bullet point, but that we look at them as a group and see how we can, take that information forward as we design. And, it's important to have these conversations early enough in the process so that the design's not too, far cooked down, it's so that we can incorporate some ideas and some of these thoughts from the early stage. And it is an iterative process. So we may do a number of different workshops at various stages, so that as the design is a little bit further down the road, we can share back and say, we heard this, and this is how we're incorporating it. So it's fun to see how it evolves for us, but I think it's also fun for them to see, how we are actually incorporating ideas and thoughts and, into the design.
Yeah, I love that you're finding ways to get the student voices in, because sometimes there's great ideas, sometimes there's not. But even if there's just like something that you're going to do anyway, and the students feel like their voice was heard, that adds so much to it. And then the idea too of bringing in like the community and the senior citizens and bringing them along too, because sometimes they're the most vocal ones that can hurt kind of the initiatives, and if they feel like, oh, what are they doing? This, I went to school here, before, and it worked perfectly well for me. Being able to make them part of it and really hearing their voice and getting their input can really help in the long run.
Absolutely. And especially when we frame it as a community use, then that also piques their interest, because they recognize, this is a building where we can come to use the gym for, exercise and other ways. I mean, some communities take it, a lot further than others, but by looking for ways that this really does become a community use space, I think does lend itself to listening to all those voices and getting consensus and buy-in from everybody.
Yeah, one of the unique things about working in schools is that almost every school, and you can let me know if this happens for you guys, but when you walk into that school, there's that plaque on the wall that has typically the superintendent's name, maybe the school board, but also the architect on there. And to me, that's all about legacy. Like that is there, and that's going to be there for 30, 50, maybe even 100 years. What aspect for you, like as far as like the legacy of the type of work you're doing, what's important for you when you're done doing this? When you look back, what do you be most proud of?
Well, I think what I am most proud of is when the community, and when I say community, I mean the whole school community, sees themselves in the school. They really see their ideas reflected in the design, and that, yes, there's a lot that we as architects, take on as far as, creating the design, but when they feel as though they were part of it, I wish the plaque could include all of the names of all of the students, of everybody that was involved.
Maybe we need to figure out a digital way to do those so we can.
I know. They should. I'm sure somewhere someone's figured that out. But I mean, that is really what it's about. I know the architect, gets their name out there as, the designer of the building, but as everybody knows, it's not one person, it's not one entity. I mean, even the design team, I mean, from our geotechnical engineers to our civil engineers, mechanical, I mean, everybody has such an important role on creating this environment that again, that's what's so exciting, is that so many people come together for the good of, the end result, which is to create this building where students, for, like you said, 30, 50, 100 years are going to come and hopefully thrive in these spaces.
There's a lot of talk about AI in schools and all the technology and how it affects, and there's going to be some that are be like, oh, we don't want any of it because it's cheating and things like this, and others that are like fully embracing it, and then ones in the middle trying to figure out like what are the protocols and how can we utilize this best. What are you seeing in your work? Are you seeing technology really change the process of architecture?
We're just starting to see it scratch the surface. I think, there may be some other architects that are a little bit further down the road. We have been tapping some of our newer architects that are just coming out of school now to understand how they're using it in school. And while there is a design component, I think I just heard a story recently how there was an AI design team and then an actual design team, and they went head to head, and people voted on what was the preferred design option. And I don't remember who won, but the idea being that you hand this over to a computer to design, which I think there are some aspects of things that from a research standpoint, we could probably really utilize AI to do some of that initial, because we do a lot of research early on. And, to have them be able to do that in, a split second versus the amount of time. But, I don't know, I can't say definitively, but right now I can't imagine a scenario where we just input all this information, hand it off to the AI bots, and then they spit out the design and everyone feels good about it, because part of the process is the process and being part of that, and knowing that we went through the steps to make sure that we're hearing the voices, the ideas, and it live, like real time, hearing it. But I'm genuinely curious to see where we're going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because I know it's not going away. I just don't know yet how it's going to work its way into our profession.
Yeah. Well, Regan, as we're coming towards the end here, if there is a message that you wanted the audience to hear, what would you want them to take away most?
I think just approach each project with excitement and curiosity, and really let the process lead us to the design, and not enter into any project with any preconceived notions of how it should be done. Because if anything, what we learn is that there's no one way to create a design that provides a space for students to thrive. And I think that's what's really exciting about the work that we do.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah, I love that approach to it. So just to the listeners here, if you're not a subscriber, just hit subscribe wherever you're at. And betterlearningpodcast.com is our hub for everything on the podcast. If you have any ideas of topics that you would like to hear about, or guests, or if you'd like to be a guest, we have information on there to go through that, because we do get a lot of feedback from our audience, and we want to make sure that this is useful, because the whole purpose of this is to drive education improvement and to break down the silos and be able to combine some of these worlds that normally wouldn't be listening to each other, and it's really cool to see the involvement. So we really appreciate that. And Regan, thank you so much. I'm sure we will see each other at some upcoming events. Are you going to any conferences coming up here? I
am in the early stages of planning to go to Portland for Learningscapes in October.
All right, so. Perfect. Well, if you're there, I will see you there. So great talking with you.
Thank you.
The views and opinions expressed on the Better Learning Podcast are those of myself as an individual and my guests, and do not necessarily represent the organizations that we work for, the Association for Learning Environments, K-12, Education Leaders Organization, or Second Class Foundation.